A little bit just on the south side of the highway.
Okay, so it's like you're going to West Vienna then?
Yeah.
Okay, I know that area. Okay, well then I'll get started. Governor, it's a pleasure to talk to you upon your investiture in the Lincoln Academy of Illinois.
Well, it's quite an honor to join the ranks of such distinguished Illinoisans.
The Lincoln Academy always had a special spot in your heart while you were in the governor's mansion. I know that it was one of the most enjoyable duties you've had over the years.
Definitely. In fact, even when I was Secretary of State, I used to always attend because what impressed me was the quality of the people that were honored and the chance to listen to them kind of give some words of wisdom, something that I didn't feel quite comfortable trying to do or able to be on the same par with the people that have been selected. But it's one of the, I think, great moments every year in the state because it's the one time people from all over Illinois come together to honor truly outstanding men and women who have shaped this state.
Well, you've certainly been one of those outstanding men who's come along and shaped the state for many years to come. Let's talk about your story. Growing up in Charleston, Illinois, how did the values of that community and the leadership that your mother took as the single head of a household there, how did that shape your life?
Well, there's no doubt. I think you are, to a great extent, shaped by your environment. And my environment was a small town in central Illinois where people looked out for each other, and also a mother who had to serve both as mother and father after my father was killed in a car wreck. So she had a strong sense of right and wrong, and that was instilled in all of us in the family. We also were instilled with the fact that the community looked out for the community, helped those who needed help. So there's no doubt much of what I am, at least the good parts of what I am today, I developed early on from my mother's tutelage and also growing up in Charleston.
Your family, as I've read, were nominally Democrats in those days, but you took something of an independent streak and went for the Republican Party.
Well, in first grade, I got involved in the election at school for president and supported Dwight Eisenhower. This was 1952, and he won, and I went home very proud of the fact that I had helped Eisenhower win, and told my parents, and that's when I found out they were Democrats. But they were nominal Democrats at best. They weren't active. My family had not been active in politics, and I was the first one to, and only one really, to be kind of the politician in the family. In fact, all the uncles and aunts and cousins and all referred to me as the politician in the family.
There were plans for you to go to law school or into some other profession than this.
Well, my mother always said she had hoped I would become a doctor or maybe a lawyer, not necessarily a politician. Now, after I became governor, I think she finally decided maybe I had done all right. Actually, I had been accepted in the law school at the University of Illinois when I was graduating from Eastern in 1968 in the morning. In the afternoon, I got a telegram from this institute where I now work saying that I'd been accepted in the legislative internship program. And it took me about 1/10 of a second to know I wanted to be in the internship program instead of going to law school. One, the internship program paid, and we had a young family, and secondly, it would put me in the middle of the action, and I thought that would be a lot more enjoyable than law school.
What appealed to you about politics, Governor?
Well, a variety of things. I think perhaps most importantly, growing up in the 50s, it was obvious that people in government were making important decisions. I mean, the atomic bomb was there. I mean, we were in the Cold War. It was very important that good people were in elected office, and it also seemed like an area where you could make a difference. So for a variety of reasons, I wanted to be in politics. I think part of that might have been a little bit of ego. I mean, it does give you that satisfaction, but more importantly, you can make a difference and you can help solve some of the challenges, whether it's your community, your state, or your nation's facing.
When you got that telegram from Sam Gove and headed to Springfield, what was it like to hit the ground in the Springfield of the late 60s?
Oh, I was scared to death. I mean, here I'm from Charleston, and Springfield was a big city. I mean, it had several stoplights. We only had one in Charleston, and it had several movie theaters, which was all the culture I needed. And I just thought, this is the big time, and you know, student government at Eastern isn't quite the same as the the Illinois State Senate, where I was assigned to work. But it was just very exciting, because at that time, this was right before the 1968 election. Then a few weeks after I started, the 68 election occurred, and Dick Ogilvy was elected governor. So you brought in a new governor. I worked for Senator Russell Arrington, who was the power in the legislature, and later on those two teamed up to enact the state income tax. And I had the opportunity to sit right next to the senator on the floor of the Senate that session, and without doubt the most productive or most active legislative session in probably the history of the state. And it was quite a opportunity for a 22-year-old just out of college to sit there and watch history being made. And you know, that definitely convinced me I wasn't going back to law school. I was going to stay in state government.
Senator Arrington was a formidable figure. As I never had the pleasure of making his acquaintance, but he could be quite intimidating to a lot of people. It must have been quite an experience to meet a fellow like that.
He could be quite intimidating. He was very bright, very energetic. Even though he was in his 60s when I came there, he was without doubt the person that brought the legislature onto equal footing with the executive branch of government. Something at the time that I thought was good. Later, times I think I had regrets. But Senator Arrington was someone who instilled in me that we're here in government to solve problems, and that if we don't solve problems, we're not successful. Just winning election and re-election is not the purpose of being in government, and that's something that stuck with me for the next 30 years. But it was a great way to start out my career in government, and without doubt that had a lot to do with shaping my political career and what I thought government was all about.
You had in that session, when the state income tax was passed, at that time you saw some real profiles and courage. People were putting their political livelihood, their political capital on the line there. Those were no easy votes.
No, they weren't. I mean, and everybody knew that was going to be a tough vote. But the state was at a point where they had no alternative. And in both the House and the Senate, a lot of members stuck their neck out. Now, interesting, I don't think anybody lost when they ran for re-election because of that vote in the legislature. Now, many felt that defeated Richard Ogilvy. He never thought that, and I don't necessarily either. I think that probably creating the Environmental Protection Agency caused him more problems with particularly downstate voters where he didn't do as well, and particularly rural voters. But there is no doubt it took courage on the part of both the governor and the legislature to do that. Courage that you don't often see in Springfield.
You also worked with House Speaker Robert Blair. Tell me about him.
Extremely bright person. Little more. One of the problems often that occurred was, I think, in politics, paranoia. I mean, you're always kind of suspect. I didn't notice that in Senator Arrington. I didn't notice that later in Jim Thompson when I worked for him. But Speaker Blair had a little bit of that. Of course, Dan Walker was governor, and there was quite a confrontation during that period. But Bob Blair was a very bright person, had a good sense of vision. He could see the big picture. He was the creator of the Regional Transportation Authority, which many believe cost him his seat for re-election. And that might have cost him his seat. But in the long run, that was a very important accomplishment for, particularly in the northeastern part of the state of Illinois.
You talked about this whole era as helping to shape your political outlook. You've been described as a moderate Republican. How is that an accurate description for you, and how would you describe what that means to be one?
Well, I think it's probably as accurate as any of these. I mean, any of these labels can be oversimplifications, because each issue you kind of decide on that issue. And I think some people, when I was elected, were surprised at how fiscally conservative I was. Of course, we were broke, so that shapes your philosophy. But on social issues, I was probably more moderate than some thought a Republican might be. But again, it would vary to each issue, and I'm sure over the years I've moderated a little bit. I'm sure I'm more conservative now than I was when I got out of college, but I think that's true of most people. I said getting married and having children is the most conservative thing in my lifetime. You start worrying about those kind of things other than some of the grandiose things that you worry about in college.
When did you decide that you wanted to go for elective office? You ran for the Illinois House in '74.
Oh, in third grade.
Okay.
I mean, I got elected in my first office in second grade and got elected in third grade class president, and I remember telling the teacher that I wanted to be president. Now, I was really misguided in my youth, but I knew I wanted, if I could, to be in politics and elected office. And throughout school, grade school, junior high, high school, college, I was always active in student government. First time I ran, I lost at the age of 28, and I thought my political career was over, but I stuck with it and got another chance and did pretty well after that.
What did you learn from that loss?
Well, I always say there's two things, very important things. One, you can always lose, and two, I never wanted to lose again. You learn a lot more by losing. I think you realize it takes a lot of effort to run for office. A lot of folks aren't paying that much attention. There are things you think they know, they don't know. You think there are things they care about, they don't care about. You learn that some people will tell you they're going to be for you, but they're not necessarily always there. It's a great learning experience. It's something, though, I'd rather do on the front end than in the back end. I always said if I'm going to lose an election, I'd rather be the first instead of the last.
When you won a seat in the Illinois House, how was it different? Actually, you had been familiar with the policy-making aspects of it, working in the Senate and House, but what was it like to actually go in and be a backbench freshman?
Well, in some ways it was exciting, in other ways it was frustrating. Prior to becoming a member of the House, I'd been the chief aide to the Speaker. I had a lot of authority as a chief aide to the Speaker. When I got elected to the House, we were in the minority, and I didn't have all that much power. But I did have the final say over how I voted. Nobody could tell me how to vote, and so I appreciated that. But I have to say that it wasn't quite as exciting. I didn't feel quite as productive as I thought I would when I had been the chief aide to the Speaker. I think that has a lot to do with being in a majority or being in a minority.
You came to the attention of one James R. Thompson not long into your legislative career. Tell me about your relationship with him and how that evolved.
Well, we actually met, we were both campaigning in 1976 when I got elected to the House and he got elected governor. And but the first, I guess, major dealing we had was he had a piece of legislation before the legislature, and I was a member of the committee where that was going to be heard. It was very controversial, and I told him I couldn't support it. And I think he was taken back because he just figured I'm a Republican and we'd always got along. But I said that, you know, I didn't agree philosophically with how that piece of legislation was drafted, and I was nervous because I knew enough. I'd been around. A freshman legislator doesn't tell his governor no, very often anyway. And he looked at me and said, "Well, what will it take to get your vote?" He says, "I know you don't want jobs. You're not trying to trade." I said, "No, I want you to change part of this legislation, then I can support it." And he did, and I supported it. So as a result of that, I think I always thought that maybe Governor Thompson knew that, that I had a mind of my own, and he always treated me with respect. We had some differences on other issues, but for the most part, I was supportive of his legislative agenda. We both were considered moderate Republicans, though we're much different personalities and different styles. And so when he had an opening for his chief legislative aide, I was very surprised when he called me and asked me to do it, and I told him no, because I didn't want to leave the legislature. He said, "Well, think about it." And so I thought about it and finally decided to do it. And it was a good move, as it turned out, because it also gave me the opportunity to work with him, and he determined from that I was someone he would appoint Secretary of State when that vacancy occurred.
That was an interesting decision for him because he had good candidates. He had George Ryan, Speaker, who was lined up to be Speaker in the House. He had Jim Edgar. What's the story behind that?
Well, I think everybody was surprised when he named Jim Edgar because of all the people he had. He had a couple congressmen who had come back and expressed interest, as well as George Ryan, some other people. And here he kind of picked this unknown for all practical purposes. I was 34 years old. I'd been a state legislator for less than 2 terms. They knew me in Charleston. That was about it. So that was, there's no doubt, that was one of the great opportunities in my life when he named me Secretary of State. I mean, that gave me the chance to try to take advantage of the opportunities that have been given me to make the most of it. And with that, that's how I got to be governor. So I think the story, I guess, behind it was that we'd worked very closely for 2 years. And Jim Thompson, I always thought, was very good at finding new talent or people to bring into government and having a good sense who would work and who wouldn't work. It means some people were better at jobs than others, and this was an important appointment for him, and I think he felt that I could do the job, even though most people didn't know me, and the politicians were somewhat aghast that here's a 34-year-old who was not known as a politician to be named Secretary of State, which at that point was considered a very political office.
That was a job that you took and decided to take an activist stance in tougher DUI laws. You worked on literacy projects. What did you see as the role for Secretary of State, beyond just signing driver's licenses?
At that point, really that had been what Secretary of State was a great name recognition office because your name was on every driver's license. You used to be able to name about 3,000 workers. You couldn't do that anymore because we had a code, but it was viewed as a great political office, but not one that did much policy. I mean, it was just a kind of a routine administrative office. And I wanted to do more in policy, so we identified areas that we felt that Secretary of State ought to be in leadership role. One was on traffic safety, and at that point, the drunk driving laws in Illinois were some of the weakest in the nation, and we were able to make them the toughest. When I left office, MAD had ranked Illinois as having the toughest drunk driving laws in the nation. So that was a major concern. Also, as state librarian, I took that job very serious because, one, I love books and I love libraries, and we did a lot to promote libraries and to work with them. And then from that, I heard Barbara Bush speak one time at American Library Association. She talked about the problem of illiteracy. And it seemed to me that's something we should be concerned about in Illinois. So I convinced Governor Thompson to create a commission, of which he named me chairman, to deal with literacy. And we began to work on that. And then a third issue that came up, for years, Illinois they tried to have a law to require insurance, mandatory auto insurance, and it always had failed, just as drunk driving laws had always failed. Well, once we were done passing the drunk driving laws, which people said we couldn't pass, we took on mandatory auto insurance, and everybody said, you're not going to get this one, and we were able to get that. So it was enjoyable to me to kind of take on those issues, as well as trying to improve the administrative structure in the Secretary of State's office, which I think we did a good job of that. I think the office was very well run when we left, better than when we took over. And to me, that was important because part of the executive branch, media has a tendency to kind of concentrate on legislative action and what the legislature does or what executive members might do in the legislature. That's important, but even more important is how you manage your office, because that's really where most people come in contact with government, is how the executive branch manages those offices, whether it be the Secretary of State office or the governor's office. And I always felt that was an area that we needed to work extra hard on, and to make people feel like that government did work, that it wasn't just a bureaucratic nightmare, but instead it was an agencies there to try to help them with their problems.
Let's take that a step further. When Jim Thompson decided not to seek another term after serving as long as he did, what part of you said, there's something I know that I can do for Illinois as governor, that that made up your mind to do that?
Well, I think for years everybody had speculated, and when Jim Thompson, if he ever did decide not to run, and there were times I was beginning to think that he might be there for life, that I probably would be a candidate. I thought that, you know, based off my time in the legislative branch and the executive branch, I had a sense how you could make government work, not just pass a bill, but make things work so people could hopefully get help by government action. Also, I felt that I had a sense of what people needed or what they cared about. From particularly my 10 years as Secretary of State, I was traveling all the time and listening to people. So I thought I could bring some expertise and a sensitivity to the needs of the people and provide leadership to help Illinois during the 90s. And then, of course, I had to go out and convince people of that, and that was a great education. Running for governor in Illinois has got to be one of the most strenuous political undertaking you could ever undertake, particularly in 1990. We had, of course, we had 14 years of Republican governorship. A lot of people thought that was too long, and then my opponent was very well known, Neil Hartigan, who was the Attorney General. We both had excellent name recognition. We both had huge amounts of money available. We both had our parties wanting us to win. So it was a hard-fought campaign, and one that I think I'm still a little tired from.
How did taxes become a centerpiece of that campaign?
Well, it became a centerpiece, and it was kind of a reverse. Usually people think Republicans are against it and Democrats are for it, but in 1989, Speaker Madigan had pushed through the legislature an increase in the income tax, but it was only temporary. And it was for education and local government, and it was going to expire the first year of the new governor. Well, I quickly, as soon as I announced for governor, I indicated I would support efforts to make that permanent, because I didn't see how you could take hundreds of millions of dollars away from education without creating chaos, and the most important priority of government is education. Now, my opponent finally came out opposed to making the surtax permanent. So we had a Republican who basically they said was for making a tax permanent. They said a tax increase. I said just leave it like it was. And I had a Democrat who said he wanted to cut it. It was a major part of the campaign, and public opinion polls showed that probably 75% of the people agreed with my opponent, not with me. They didn't want to pay more taxes. But the polls also showed they trusted me. They figured I was leveling with them. And they didn't believe my opponent. They didn't believe they really were going to cut a tax, that something after the election would change and, you know, they wouldn't do it. So while it made the election probably much closer, I think it did at least leave the impression, which I thought was very important, that I was somebody who was going to be very honest with them. And after the elections, it turned out, we found the state was bankrupt, then a recession hit. No way we could have done away with that tax. And if we had done that, left it, and I had campaigned against it, I think that would have caused a huge credibility problem. And that's something to me that's maybe as important as anything an elected official does, is to create trust with the electorate. And the way you destroy that trust is if you do something different after the election than you said you were going to do before the election. So now sometimes circumstances can change, and maybe you can't avoid it, but I think even if you have no choice, it still leaves a bad taste in people's mind. And so I felt even better after the election when we realized that the serious financial straits we were in, that I had taken the position I'd taken.
When you came to office, as you said, you had $1 billion in debt. I know there were a lot of things that you wanted to do right out of the gate for people and programs, but you were in a position where you had to start cutting things back. You started cutting staff in the executive office and a number of other state agencies. Those were tough times and tough decisions that had to be made.
Well, it wasn't a happy time around Springfield. I mean, I think I had every group in the state at one time protest outside my office. The Democrats referred to me the first 2 years as Governor No. Now, I took that as a compliment, because most people on the street understood that. I mean, they understood if you don't have the resources, you've got to say no. And so, you know, it was tough, but it was the right thing to do, and I felt that the public would support me. And come election in 1994, they showed that they approved of my approach. But it was tough to change the legislature. The legislature, by nature, likes to spend. I mean, that's politicians, and I'm the same way. You like to make people happy. You don't make people happy by saying no. So it was difficult to change the insiders and the culture in Springfield to say, instead of spending more, we're going to spend less. Instead of creating more jobs, we're actually going to eliminate jobs. We tried to minimize the hurt. When you're talking about laying people off, that's a very difficult thing. We tried to minimize the hurt there. And in cutting back on programs, we tried to identify those programs that were essential versus those programs that were good, but they weren't essential. And to minimize, again, any of the problems reducing those programs would cause. And I think we did as good a job as you could under those circumstances of getting the state through a very difficult time, keeping our commitments, and then positioning Illinois for the rebound that occurred in the mid-90s. And today I think the state's far stronger because of those efforts that we made in the early 90s.
Taxes were also a major part of the second campaign for governor for you. Don Clark Netsch had one thought about raising the state income tax and providing property tax relief. You pretty well clobbered her on that in the campaign, as I remember.
Well, in her proposal, she didn't talk about reforms. And one of the things we knew that was going to have to occur is reform, particularly in the Chicago schools. Actually, what we clobbered her on more was on crime. I mean, if you look at the poll numbers we looked at, and when things switched, it was more when we attacked her position on crime. But her position on dealing with school financing, without the reforms, I didn't think was going to work, and it wouldn't have worked. In fact, what we finally were able to do 3 years later was because, in the meantime, we did have meaningful reform, particularly for the Chicago schools. And once we were able to get the Chicago schools reform, then we were able to take a look at providing some additional dollars for schools. Now, even I found that you couldn't convince certain legislators to raise the income tax, even though we might lower the property taxes at a lower level than she had talked about. But even that, we had the votes, but we didn't have the presiding officer, which is another lesson I learned late in life.
When you got, we will touch on that. When you got that, when the legislature gave Mayor Daley the power to run the schools, were you surprised that things would turn around as quickly as they did?
No, in fact, we, in the governor's office, we actually came up with the outline of what we would do. There was a lot of different opinions in the legislature. At that point, the legislature was controlled by the Republican Party. There were some who even wanted to take it over the state, and I said, no, we're not going to take over the Chicago schools. But I'm blank all of a sudden. Arnie, head of the Civic Committee.
Oh, I can think of.
President of Northwestern.
Oh, okay.
Hey, just
Arnold.
Oh.
Come on, Nixon cabinet officer.
Yeah.
He was a laureate.
Yes.
3 years ago. Arnold.
Weber.
Okay.
Okay, let me go
We'll
back to
we'll
this.
pick
Okay.
up with.
Well, Arnie Weber, who had been the president of Northwestern, then became the head of the Commercial Club Civic Committee in Chicago. We sat down, and since he had been in education, I respected his opinion. Plus, he was speaking for a lot of business people too. What he felt would work on the Chicago schools and what I could accept, we kind of reached an agreement, and then that was the basis for what we put through the legislature. We thought it could work because it gave more power to the Chicago School Board and the mayor than any school district had in this country. And I will give Mayor Daley credit. While he did not support the bill, only one Democrat legislator voted for the bill. He did put good people in once it became law, and those people, I think, have done a good job of taking that law, which gave him broad powers, and have turned the school system around. And as a result of that, it made it much easier than for us to go to the legislature and say we need more money for education, because before the argument used to be we're just going to throw good money after bad. But after the Chicago school reform, and particularly when Republican legislators were part of that reform, it was easier to get them to agree we needed more money for the schools. Now, we had some disagreement on how we raised that money, and we raised taxes, but we didn't necessarily raise the income tax as I would have liked, and lowered property taxes, but we did raise some other taxes that they had opposed in the past, and we were, most importantly, able to provide more money to the poorer school districts in the state. And that was the real reason behind the Eikenberry Commission and all of our efforts, and we were successful there. And to some extent, we were probably victims on the property tax to the success of the property tax caps that I had campaigned on in '90 and been able to get put in by the legislature that had saved property taxpayers billions of dollars. So there wasn't quite as much pressure, particularly among suburban Republicans, to do something on the property taxes. But we were able to get the foundation level established, which to me was the most important part of the whole proposal. And that means many schools throughout Illinois that before didn't have adequate funds now have at least the minimal amount needed to provide for a quality education.
Let's hold that thought, because it's time to change tapes.
Let's just switch the bars for a few seconds.
Okay.
It's the second. It's the
Commercials helped we ran, but they were so afraid of the income tax at that point. And they didn't, the pressure, because the caps had worked beyond any of our beliefs.
Yeah, they worked great.
Yeah, and because I remember in the '90 campaign, everybody laughed at me when I talked about the caps. And
We'll go for as long as he'll have me. Well, we're going to about 3:15 because I know we've got to clear out the office.
yeah, we're all right. All right, I can go to another office and talk to people.
Okay, we're rolling anytime, Jack.
Okay. There was another time when you were talking about, let me just pick this up a different way perhaps. You had proposed on the basis of a report written by the Eikenberry Commission that income taxes would be raised while property taxes would be lowered commensurately. It put a Republican governor, though, again, in the position of asking for a tax increase.
Well, and yeah, because there's going to be a little bit more money from the income tax increase and the property tax reduced, so we could put it into particularly the poor school districts. And it was an issue that, needless to say, legislators were very skittish about. And in the end, it was Speaker Madigan, who the first 4 years I'd been governor had been my greatest nemesis, became my main ally. And Senator Phillip, who at times had been supportive and other times we disagreed, became my major nemesis. What was ironic on that, though, we passed out of the House, and I had been assured at some point that Senator Phillip was going to come back with a reduction. He would do the income tax be reduced. Well, I didn't want to offer a reduction. I wanted him, because I didn't want to have to compromise off my compromise. Well, it never came. In fact, the last day of the session, he even suggested it to me, and I said, I think it's a little late, Senator. It's the last day of the session. So we didn't resolve that. But then the next fall, we came back, and we did agree to raise some other taxes that he'd opposed that I'd suggested in the past, like on riverboats. We raised cigarette taxes. We also put a tax on certain telephone transactions. And that came up with the equivalent of money we were going to put into schools. But we weren't able to get the property tax relief that we'd hoped, but we also didn't raise the income tax.
Given the mechanics and the politics of Springfield and the state being the diverse state that it is, do you think we will ever be able to revisit that issue and do it meaningfully?
Not in the current people who are in political office today. I mean, I don't see it in the near future. If you get different leaders, different executive branch, possibly. But I don't see it soon. And again, as I said, we were victims to our own success. The property tax caps, which I had campaigned on in '90 and got passed in the early '90s, had done a very good job of slowing down property taxes in the suburban area where they'd really been the most difficult. And as a result, that I think has taken a lot of the pressure off. I think it's still unfortunate that we have to rely so much on property taxes for schools, but I'm not optimistic in the near future. Now, there's also another problem in the state. It has to do with Cook County as a differential on how they assess property taxes, and that's going to have to, I think, be dealt with probably before we see a massive shift away from the property tax to an income tax in Illinois.
Is it also partly due to the fact that the control of the House and Senate is so narrow right now, and everybody's going to use this to beat up on everybody else in the elections?
Well, but you look back in 1997, Speaker Madigan supported my efforts, and I think almost every Democrat voted for that in the House, and they kept control of the legislature. The Republicans who supported it in the House, those that ran, they all won. I really think that there is that fear. I think you got to look to where people run. Those who run in primaries, particularly in the suburbs, I think maybe where you have a tendency of more of a extreme conservative element that has a major say in those primaries, they're probably more at risk. But for those who run in general elections, which is true in most downstate districts, I don't think that was the risk they thought it was. And those who did vote for it proved that they were able to survive that without any problem. I think there had been a greater problem for those who voted against it if we hadn't done something for the schools. In fact, the Republicans came to me and they very much wanted a compromise because they were being viewed as the bad guys because they had not helped the schools. And I know in my own, we would track and poll numbers, and the biggest jump I had in my 8 years as governor in job approval was when I proposed the school funding proposal. It jumped up about 15 points. It was pretty good before, but it jumped very high and it stayed. So I never bought the argument that you couldn't go out and explain to the people why you did what you did and do it in a rational manner. And I think they may not like paying it, but I think they'd understand. But I think I might be in a minority in that belief.
We've talked a lot about education funding, and that's been one that everyone has, obviously, everyone has an interest in that. But hello, rented lips today. Your 2 terms in office, you also did significant work in the human services areas. You combined facets of different agencies to form a new Department of Human Resources. You had a lot of different programs like Project Success, Kid Care. How do those programs reflect your personal interests as governor in people?
Well, when I ran for governor, I said our top priority was not education. I never said I want to be the education governor. Some people have said, but our #1 priority are kids. Now, education is an important part of kids, but also helping kids who are caught up in abusive homes or in foster care, helping them get permanent loving homes is equally, if not more important. And we worked hard in many areas dealing with children, particularly children who were disadvantaged for a variety of reasons. And that's something I just felt that, again, that's one of the basic responsibility of government, of community, is to help those people, particularly those young people who, for whatever reason, aren't receiving the adequate care they need at home. I think the thing I'm proudest of probably is what we did in the area of adoption. When I became governor, we only saw about 400 kids in the state's care be adopted each year, even though we saw huge increases in our caseloads in Children and Family Services. When I left office 8 years later, that number was at 5,000 a year. We were one of the best in the nation. We were cited at the White House for our efforts in Illinois. And to me, that's just, I can't think of anything more important than to provide loving, permanent homes for children. And we had completely turned that process around in Illinois. And I think a lot of other areas in the social service, particularly for kids, we have made significant changes that probably didn't get the visibility because they weren't necessarily a legislative battle. It was more better management. What we were able to do just in Children and Family Services, that department went through some very difficult times, but I think it's viewed now nationally as one of the best in the country. Jess McDonald, the director, has done an excellent job. We've provided the resources and given the time for them to kind of turn that ship around in a manner. We recognize the old philosophy that was in play when I became governor, that family first, whatever it did, keep that family together. We recognized in some cases those families shouldn't be kept together. They didn't function, that you had to do what was best for the child. And that change in philosophy, I think, has gone a long way in helping children in this state have a better chance of a quality of life. So, you know, I feel good about what we accomplished in that area and in other areas too. But again, if you can help a child come up with a loving home to grow up in, you've done more for that child than anything else you can do.
Those programs had a very special place with the First Lady. How much of her own personal philosophy was reflected in how your administration worked in those areas?
Well, I always talk about we, and most everything I did in consultation with Brenda. I mean, Brenda was not one who wanted to be governor. I mean, she is not one who had her own agenda. But as a mother, she felt very strong about children issues, and she was a good advisor, and she was also an excellent partner. I mean, a lot of what a governor does is you use the bully pulpit, and sometimes it's hard to get the message over if you're given a message the news media is bored with. And if it's not a battle with the legislature or a battle with the mayor of Chicago, sometimes the media in Illinois tunes you out. But I found out they didn't tune out Brenda. And Brenda was very good at being able to travel around the state, talk about a lot of these issues from a mother's perspective that I think had a very positive impact. So I think it was very appropriate that when we were at the White House, and it wasn't the governor receiving the award, it was the governor and the First Lady receiving the award. And that's true of many things that I accomplished. Now, my shortcomings, she didn't have anything to do with those. But Brenda was I think, of course, I'm prejudiced. I thought she was an excellent First Lady, and I think a lot of people appreciated her concern. And I think she was able to use her bully pulpit in a manner that helped many good causes become successful.
You had an incredible job approval rating for a governor. Your poll numbers are very good. A third term was yours for the asking, or going to the U.S. Senate, but you decided to go out at the top of the game, the top of your game.
Well, it's like when I saw Michael Jordan shoot that basket last year to win the NBA. I said he ought to go now. A variety of things. I've been at this for 30 years. I've been governor for 8 years, Secretary of State for 10 years. That's longer than anybody had held elected statewide office, and I felt good about it. I think you can overstay. Also, while I'm still relatively young for Illinois politics, there were other things in life I thought I would like to do, and probably better to make the change when I was still young enough to change. You know, it'd been 18 years since I'd driven a car in Illinois. It's been 18 years since I waited in a line at an airport. A lot of those things that, you know, most everybody has to do, and I thought probably for my own well-being, I may be better to get back to normalcy. But I felt good about what we'd accomplished. The state was in very good shape. I thought we'd accomplished most everything we wanted to. We didn't get everything 100%. You never do. But we were providing money for the poor school districts at a much better rate. We had reformed the social service agencies. We had done a lot, which again, an area that not much talk about, but I think very significant, in natural resources. We had acquired more land than any time in the history of the state. We had, I thought, done a good job of balancing between environmentalist and the business interest, trying to make sure that we had a strong economy, but we protected our natural resources. So I just thought, you know, things were going well. I'd done what I had hoped to do. I'd had the opportunity for 2 terms, and you know, I think it is good for change, both for the individual and probably for the state, and this was the time to go.
How's the transition been?
It's been fine. I mean, after 30 years of being here and almost 20 years before wanting to get here, I knew it was going to be a little tricky just because for all those years I'd been working up to this point. And now I had left there, and I really didn't have any long-range plans except maybe to walk a little more with the dogs in the woods and see the grandkids a little more. But it's been fine. I have no regrets. I mean, there's no point I thought, boy, I wish I was still governor, or I should have gone to the U.S. Senate. Now, there are always things another governor, another state government's going to do different than I would do, and I might say, gee, I've done that different. But that's normal, I think, and I tell myself that, you know, there's always more than one right way to do something, and don't worry about it. I've enjoyed the opportunity to be on campus and talk with students. That's one of the, I enjoyed that as governor. I didn't get to do it that much, but I have a lot more opportunity now to do that. I like doing the little things. I mean, you know, it's been interesting for me to go to the filling station and put the credit card in and things, you know. I have to tell you this one story. I was at one event and I was driving in, and the guy was kind of shocked to see me driving, and I said, where should I park my car? And he says, park it up by that Aurora. And I looked at the guy with me and said, what's an Aurora? I mean, you know, when I was paying attention, they were called Oldsmobiles. But those little things have been kind of fun to kind of reconnect. And also at night, I'm home, or, you know, I don't have to worry when I pick up the newspaper quite as much as I used to about which one of my 65,000 employees did something wrong that I'm being personally blamed for. So it's gone well. I miss the people very much. I lived in Springfield. We've lived in Springfield, except for the 4 years we were back in Charleston as a state legislator, most all our adult life. So I miss those people I've worked with, for some of them for 30 years. I miss getting around the state. And I miss the thrill when you cut a ribbon or you make people very happy. But again, I've got my memories and I can enjoy that. And also, I've got to do some new things I've never done before.
Let's talk about that. What's the difference between the college students of, say, your day, late 1960s, and the young people that you're meeting here at the University of Illinois and at other places when you come to SIU Carbondale, for example?
Well, back in the 60s, we didn't even know what state government was. I mean, I took all the courses on state government at Eastern, and that was 2. And that was half with local government. So for the most part, we didn't pay attention to what was going on in Springfield. The news didn't cover it. Today, it strikes me the students are much better informed, at least the ones I had the chance to interact with. There are also, I think, there's some similarities. In the 60s, I think we all wanted to go out and change the world. We were very idealistic. I mean, I know when I got out of Eastern in 1968, I had all the answers. And I didn't want to make money. I wanted to make the world a better place. And I think most people felt that way. I think maybe that changed later on. I sensed with students today, they still have that sense they want to make things work. I think they might be a little more realistic also on the other side, that they've got to get a job, they've got to make a living. Just because you get a college degree, that's not a guarantee as it was for us in the 60s that you're always going to have a good job. I've been very impressed. I've had the chance here at Champaign, at the campus at Chicago, as well as Carbondale at SIU, I've also at the University of Chicago, to talk to students. I want to have a chance to talk with some community college students this summer and some other students around the state. I'm very, very positive about the future based off the kids I've come in contact with in the classrooms.
Insofar as you're working basically in a think tank here at the U of I, and you'll be going to Harvard, to the JFK school, what public policy issues excite you, and you think you've still got some contributions to make?
Well, I think I've got to remember I'm no longer governor. I mean, you've got to remember that you're not the person setting policy. If you can help, I probably, to this point, I have been hesitant. I mean, if somebody asks me, I'll tell them, but I'm not going to go volunteer. I think there are issues that I can see we need to look at. I mean, one is in the school issue. One of the things we need to start preparing for is to re-examine the formula we use to determine what that minimal level should be. In the legislation, we set up that in 3 years the legislature should reevaluate it, and if it needs to be raised, then it should be raised. I think we need to start looking at that now, because that's very important, the way we put that formula together. I wasn't just picking some number out of the sky. So that's going to take some time, and I think that process ought to start now. Another area that I feel very strongly is the fiscal stability of the state. The General Assembly this last session, they passed a lot of bills. They spent a lot of money. One thing they didn't do, though, was create a rainy day fund, which they said they wanted to do. I think they need to do that while we still have a little money left. We didn't have that luxury in the early 90s because we were trying to pay our bills, but fortunately at the end of the 90s we were able to build up a pretty good surplus. Now they've kind of got into that, and that's fine, but they need to make sure before it's gone they've set aside a substantial amount of that surplus for that rainy day fund, because things can change very quickly, and state government revenues, especially in Illinois, we can have our revenues drop almost overnight. And I went through that. I grew up in that generation after the Depression generation, and our parents were always very cautious, and because they went through the Depression. Well, we couldn't appreciate that. Well, I went through the first 4 years as governor, probably caused me to be kind of depression-oriented. I mean, I'm very conscious you've got to be careful in government because it can change quickly. Now, future governments may not have experienced that, and I just hope that we have the reserve set aside so when that occurs, and it will occur again, that we're better prepared than we were when I got to be governor in 1991.
As you look back on the career in public office, what's been the most satisfying thing for you?
The people. I mean, working with people to solve problems. And by people, I mean more than just government, though there's a lot of great people in government, and I think a lot in the bureaucracy get a bum rap, often from us politicians who want a scapegoat. But particularly when you work with people who volunteer their time, or community groups or businesses, I mean, that partnership, I think, has produced the best government. And when you see that work, like on the Eikenberry Task Force, see them spend months working on that and something finally happens, and it's going to help people for years to come. Watching what's happened in adoption, seeing some of the land we've been able to set aside, develop it for natural resources so people can enjoy it, that gives you a lot of satisfaction. And so knowing that the system can work, that you can help people, that there is a purpose for all this.
One last question. Do you think we'll ever see your name on another election poster?
Well, I have no plans. I mean, and people who know me know I've always planned ahead. But I also have learned you never say never. But I don't want to leave. That's a hint. For the first time in my life, the last 2 years, I've had no political plans. Whether that'll change, who knows? I'm still in Illinois politics, young. I guess I could, change my mind. I enjoyed the last election because I was younger than both gubernatorial candidates. I think all gubernatorial candidates in that last election. But I've enjoyed my time in government. I think we did good. I'm not sure that it's not time to go do other things, and that's why I made the decision I made 2 years ago.
Has anything grabbed your attention that you figure, I haven't done this before and I've really got to do it?
Well, I'm serving on some corporate boards. I enjoy that, to kind of learn some areas of financing or what's going on in telecommunications, all these things I didn't know, just to try to learn more. There's no one thing yet that's grabbed me that I want to spend 100%. I enjoy the teaching. I enjoy having a chance to be on these boards. I enjoy having a little more chance at night to read and go for a hike. So I'll just keep looking and listening, and maybe something will grab me like politics grabbed me back in first grade.
I'd love to see what happens. Thanks very much, Governor.
Thank you.
It's always been a pleasure to
Enjoy
work
it.
with you on these things. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
And we'll just shoot a little
Okay.
at the end. Lawrence told me, so it was the biggest shock to see you drive up in your car the other night to Dixie Barbecue.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the other day I drove up to see a race, Chicago, and I'm coming through the tollway, and I come through where you get the toll in it, and the guy about fell out of his booth. I pulled in there,
I'll bet.
because he just looked at me and says, "Governor," and I said, "Here, thank you. Have a good day." So now it does get people. I'll walk around the downtown loop of Chicago. I had a couple meetings across the loop, and I had to carry a small suitcase, and so I'm hustling across, and people are looking like, "That's you." Or when I came to the train station one time, I got out with my suitcase and walked out to get a taxi, and just kind of, you could tell people just that's the governor. What's he doing?
Well, that's like turning around in the hallways now, tripping over Paul Simon.
Yeah.
You're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
There should be a lot of, but, well, it looks like you're having a great time, and I'm glad to hear it.
No,